has a very big role to play in making democracy work and in advancing our pursuit for the progress of our nation. But in order to contextualize the relationship between being a youth leader and, of course, pushing for an effective democracy, let us first unpack the term, okay? So what really makes an effective democracy? So to help us unpack this term, our first panel will talk about these big terms and share their insights on our segment, Democracy and Citizenship. Okay, so joining our pool of panelists are, number one, we have the co-founder and head of practice of WeSolve Foundation, coordinator of Citizens Budget Tracker and Move as One Coalition. We have Mr. Kenneth Abante. Hi, Ken. So Ken Abante organizes and does policy research with civil society movements, Move as One Coalition for Public Transport, Citizens Budget Tracker for Budget Transparency and Accountability, and Tarabangan Contra COVID-19 to strengthen the local health emergency response of Naga City and Camarines Sur. He serves as Managing Director of Practice and Partnerships at WeSolve Foundation, a social purpose organization that supports collective action movements towards sustainable impact. Once again, we have Ken Abante. Okay, so aside, hi Ken. And aside from Ken, we also have a lecturer from the Development Studies Department of Ateneo de Manila University. We have Ms. Zarina MEDINA-GUCE. Ms. Zarina is a sociologist specializing in democratic innovation, participatory governance, public policy, local governance, and impact assessment spanning a 15-year portfolio. She's also currently doing consultancy work for the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, and the Oxford Policy Management. She completed executive courses in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy from the National University of Singapore, and currently she serves on the board of directors of People Powered, a global non-profit working for the advancement of participatory democracy. Once again, let's welcome Ms. Zarina MEDINA-GUCE. Hi, Ms. Zarina. Good afternoon.
Hi. Hi, hello. Good afternoon to all. Hello.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
And lastly, we also have a senior lecturer from the Department of Anthropology from the University of the Philippines and the author of The Philippines is Not a Small Country. We have Dr. Gudyon LASCO. Dr. Gudyon, good afternoon to you. Dr.
Hello.
Gudyon LASCO is a physician, medical anthropologist, and a writer. He's currently based in Mexico City, where he is doing comparative research on COVID-19 responses and language studies at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. His collection of essays, The Philippines is Not a Small Country, was published by the Ateneo de Manila Press in September 2022. So friends here on Zoom and on Facebook, let's give them a virtual round of applause. So welcome to our panelists. So before we go to the Q&A later on, let's ask our panelists to briefly share their background and experience. Siguro let's begin with Ken first. So ano ba yung mga pinagkakaabalahan mo, Ken, so far?
Hello po. Unang-una, isang malaking karangalan ang masama sa napakahusay na panel at nakakatuwa po ang na makita yung maraming kabataan ngayong hapon na nagsasama-sama at nagtulong-tulong. So ngayon po we're actually in the business of trying to organize. Actually, organizing to survive is how I can probably summarize what we're doing now. Where in Naga City, for example, where we just thankfully managed our second surge together with our city. It was a very difficult surge, the Delta variant surge, but we're organizing with our city government across the different pillars of COVID response. We're also trying to make sure that our public transport is safe. So we're organizing a lot in terms of pushing for a better budget for active transport, public transport, better contracts for transport workers, and also trying to make sure that our money goes to the right place with our team members at the Citizens Budget Tracker. So siguro maybe those are just some of the organizing work that we're doing. Of course, we're very happy to be partnering with many youth organizations and youth leaders all throughout these different efforts.
Right. Thanks, Ken. How about for you, Miss Zarina? Quick background on what you're doing.
Hi. As a practice of my profession, as you said earlier, I'm serving the board of People Powered. So it's a New York-based nonprofit, and we help advocates in government and in civil society work on participatory democracy practices all over the world. And then on a personal note, for my in service now of my consultancy for UNDP, we're helping the Philippine government come up with participatory governance metrics for national and local governments, so we can start measuring the substance of participation. Hindi lang basta form, no? Parang nasanay kasi tayo na nagbibilang lang ng percentage, meron bang nakaupo, etc. But start thinking about may lalim ba, no? Is there truly influence of citizens in terms of agenda setting, decision making, implementation, learning through evaluation, etc. I'm also ending my work with Oxford Policy Management. For that naman, we're supporting the global evaluation of the Open Government Partnership, in which the Philippines and South Cotabato are exemplar case studies here. So this is for democratic innovations, transparency initiatives, social accountability, a lot of digital governance, no? So yan, aside doon, my academic work, so paano ko napunta sa lahat ng yun? My academic work really is about participatory governance and recentering, no, the question of participation in power, no, relational power. Ano ba, pag ba sinabi nating participation, paano talaga natin masusukat kung meron itong kabuluhan? So we go back to the question of power, influence, and maybe we can talk about it more in the discussion.
Yeah, we'll zoom in later on democracy and of course participation. Thanks, Ms. Zarina. How about you, Dr. Gudyon? You're in Mexico City right now, right?
Yes, I've been studying the pandemic and how people have been responding to the pandemic. I know that we have many young people here who are interested in medicine, are interested in pursuing a career in medicine. And I want to tell you that being a doctor can also involve combining social sciences and the medical sciences and looking at how people respond to health crises like COVID-19. Ano yung mga reaction ng mga tao pag may nag-positive sa COVID? Ano yung mga ginagawa ng mga tao kapag sa tingin nila meron silang infection? How do they protect themselves? Why do governments lean towards individual level actions? For example, requiring things like face shields, etc. All of these are interesting from an academic perspective, and I think it's part of medicine. As a columnist in Philippine Daily Inquirer, I also monitor current events and write about what are the issues that are vital. And young people, I know that all over the country have so many experiences, and I really encourage you to write all of the things that you're experiencing. We need to learn more from you than you from us. So yeah, I'm just really trying to be a scholar of contemporary issues, and I really look forward to this discussion. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Gudyon. So now we'll be talking about democracy and citizenship. Earlier, I asked our friends here on Zoom to share their thoughts on democracy. So we see it's for the people, it's power, it's people, it's accountability to freedom, etc. But now from your perspective, our panelists, no, people often use the term democracy or democratic governance with a common understanding that this is a government system in which power is controlled by the people, whether directly or through their representatives. So as someone deeply involved in this aspect, what does an effective democracy look like for you? Let's now begin with Ms. Zarina.
Siyempre, starting with the woman, no? Sige, okay yan. Okay. Bakit nakatahi lagi? Is it okay if I use Filipino, or should we be Or free naman tayo to code
We can
switch?
50-50.
Okay, sige. All right. Our understanding of democracy is usually tied to the form, no? Because as you mentioned, it's all about operationalizing, no, how really the how the people influences governance decisions, particularly those that are they deem important to them, no. When we say democracy, it's not just a form of government, but it's also very normative in nature. We associate certain values and certain visions around democracy. And in the heart of it all is participation, no? Participation which is measured by, at the end of the day, the level of influence that citizens have on the decisions of their government. There's a trend right now all over the world to look at more direct forms of participation aside from elections, because of the prevalent criticisms, no, of how representative formats can be co-opted by elite politics. So this is why democratic innovations, practices like what Ken is doing, no, Ken's group is doing about monitoring and using open data to make assessments and recommendations to government. So nagiging mas maigting yung ganitong mga usapin kasi nga naghahanap tayo. We continuously look for that normative vision of democracy as influence, no, influence and leveling the power, no, of citizens aside from voting in who they think should be their representatives in government.
Thanks, Ms. Zarina. How about you, Dr. Gudyon? Ano ba itong effective democracy for you?
Well, if we look at history, and I think Zarina made a very good overview of how participation is really at the core of democracy. And if we look at history, we see that the first so-called democracy in the city-states of Greece, they call it a democracy, but in fact, it was only, I believe, men who owned property who was part of that democracy. And then eventually, there were more demands towards inclusivity. And fast forward to the 19th century, women were rightfully demanding that they be given a right to vote. But even then, sino ba yung mga namumuno? It's still mostly men. And it's still mostly, in some parts of the world, white men. So democracy, I believe, is an ongoing struggle. I view it as an ongoing struggle for more inclusivity and looking at not just the participation of a few people. Can come from our Congress, has representatives from all over the country, but do they really represent the different sectors of our country? Do they really represent different social classes in our country? So it's an ongoing, for me, it's an ongoing movement towards making sure that it's as inclusive as possible. And young people need to be also part of this democracy. And there has to be meaningful ways to engage. It should definitely not just be a once in a 3-year or once in 6-year activity where we vote for people. Democracy is an everyday ability to exercise what we believe in and to organize with each other so we can push for initiatives that we believe will be helpful for not just the country, not just human beings, but also non-humans, including the environment. So that's how I would view democracy.
Thanks, Gudyon. So basically, it's a work in progress, no? Yung democracy.
Absolutely, Jules.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it's a daily activity that we need to take care of. How about you, Ken?
Thanks, Jules, Zar, and Gideon. Yung lagi kong naiisip kapag what does democracy mean in practice? I think it's really the people claiming space and people claiming their rightful place in the power structures that shape our lives. And it's so important, as to Zar and Gideon's point, for people to both directly participate, aside from the electoral process, in these larger power structures. Gusto ko magkwento siguro ng isang case where I think how coalition building really helps solve and push for change in even the most seemingly insoluble problems. So for example, traffic. Di ba? Problema pa rin siya. Pero one of the reasons that we discovered why grabe yung traffic was because we focus a lot on, moving cars instead of people, and focusing less on nature and people, but more on the vehicles that ply our roads. And did you know that since 2010, according to our budget research, around 2.8 trillion pesos, that's with a T, it's a huge amount, 2.8 trillion pesos was budgeted for road infrastructure programs, but only 1% of the 2.8 trillion was actually budgeted for the expansion of road-based public transport supply, active transport like biking. So kapag sinasabi nila, for example, na, di ba, if you really want to know a politician's priorities, don't just listen to their words, study their budgets, follow the money. And if that's the case, di ba, parang 1% lang yung atensyon na binibigay sa atin bilang mga commuter, bilang mga siklista. And in fact, a minority, only 1 in every 10 Filipino households, even less, have private cars. So it's a very interesting statistics to see, how it's another way to say we don't have the space. We also don't have the resources to serve our needs. And that's why it's so important in an effective democracy, for people to come together, not be afraid of retribution or violence from the state, if there is a contrary opinion, and really push for these changes, even if that's something that's not in the status quo. So what we did in our Coalitions for Change supported program, Move as One Coalition, we really tried to organize across different sectors. So hindi lang yung mga urban economists or urban transport advocates yung experts, but like ordinary commuters are experts on the public transport problem, and recognizing the deep wisdom in the community, and really listening and understanding that, and elevating that in the discourse so that they have the space in those public forums, in those budget hearings, in those meetings with the secretaries, to be able to push for their rightful claims to our country's resources, which also emanate from us. We pay those taxes. We vote the people in. We vote the politicians in. And so reclaiming that space is so important. So babalik tayo dun sa the most affected people get a chance to influence the power structures that shape our lives. Kaya kapag sinasabi naming it goes through Move as One's politics, we don't mean na nagpupolitikahan kami. It's not, hindi kami nagbabangayan, di ba? It's cyclists get a chance to draft cycling policies. Public transport workers and transport worker unions get a chance to draft their contracts. Persons with disabilities get a chance to change the way that public works and highways build accessible walkways and at grade crosswalks. So that for me is the essence of an effective democracy.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Ayan na, so nailatag ng ating panelists kung ano ba yung isang effective democracy in any society. But right now, yung pinaka topmost na challenges siguro na we could pinpoint. Ano yon? Ano yung mga challenges to democratic participation? What's one glaring challenge siguro from your end, in your observation? And how can this challenge be addressed? For this round, we'll begin with Gudyon.
Thank you. There's so many possible answers. If this were an exam question, it's such an easy question to answer because there are so many answers. But let me just say that among many others, I can say indifference, diba? I can say hopelessness among young people, a sense that whoever they'll vote, it will be the same. So I can point to these emotions even that people feel as a barrier to democratic inclusion. But let me single out this information. Our country has had politicians stolen so much from us. But I believe that the greatest theft is the theft of people's emotions, of winning people's hearts based on lies, based on deceit, based on false premises, and causing them to feel animosity towards democratic values, causing them to feel disdain towards fundamental values like human rights. So I think this is really a big danger, because if the very premises of democracy itself are assaulted, then it's very problematic. How can you argue with people based on human rights when they don't believe in human rights? How can you argue with people who on the basis of fairness and inclusion when they actually don't subscribe to a view that we need to be an inclusive society? So we need to look at the level of those values that people have, those principles, and the role of disinformation on the background rooted in deeper problems, like, and we can talk about educational challenges, we can talk about the structural violence that happens. And when I say structural violence, I refer to the local conditions that make it difficult for people to avail of democratic so-called virtues like exercising their right, etc. So there are many things to say, but I would just briefly highlight that because I think that moving towards the coming, it's not just about the elections. There's this information about vaccines. There's this information about public health that makes people also distrust public health institutions. So it's broader than, I'm not just referring to the political disinformation, but I think it's a broader threat to democracy at large.
Thanks, Gudyon. That's a very important issue, no, na we need to talk about itong disinformation. Kasi 'di ba kapag may disinformation, we have no, basically on social media, at least in the realm of social media, there's no shared reality. Kasi parang iba yung reality nitong kampo na to, iba yung reality ng kampo na to. So on that note, Gudyon, and maybe I'd like to ask pala muna Zarina about this, maybe from your lens as a sociologist, when we're talking about institutions, no, paano yon kapag nagkakaroon na walang shared reality yung mga tao because of this information? Do you think this is the truth? Do you think this is another version of truth? How do we parang decipher kung ano ba talaga yung pinaka-truth among all these versions?
Well, the first caveat that we have to make is that democracy doesn't require one single truth, diba? Parang a danger. One thing that we have to be conscious about is that we don't force a singular understanding kung ano ba tama, diba? Democracy demands pluralism, diba? And in democratic innovations all over the world, there is an increasing appreciation that the unity that democracy brings is not a unity of ideas but a unity of problem solving, di ba? Alin ang uunahin, ano ang priorities, and we agree on those kinds of deliberative decisions. Hindi tayo namimilit ng isa't isa na ito lang ang dapat paniwalaan and etc. Di ba? We hear it all the time, democracy demands dissent, but a better version of it, I think, is that we have to remember that democracy in practice demands pluralism, diba? And we mature as we find our way to work with each other, no? And again, in a solution-seeking perspective for development and democratic outcomes, we decide together alin ang uunahin, alin ang unang gagawin, paano tayo magtutulungan, paano natin babalikan yung mga agenda na hindi agad natitingnan at certain points in time, etc., etc., etc. So there. Yeah. With regard to this information, if you recall, there's a survey recently, di ba, na nagsasabing wala pang 1/3 of the adult population will have Facebook. And I'd like to echo what Gudyon said, no, parang it's really an echo chamber. Whatever you see in your social media feed is a product of the algorithms of what you do online. So while there are times that public sentiments seem to echo what you see in your social media, it's always very important to be cognizant, to be aware that it's just one circle out of many, 'di ba? Yung katotohanan nakikita mo sa social media is just one of many. Parang kung marami yata dito nasa school pa, no, or meron ba mga nasa school pa dito, parang 'di ba yung chismis dun sa isang org eh iba dun sa chismis dun sa kabila sa kabilang org, 'di ba? Parang ganun din 'yon. So just be aware, no, of these nuance na hindi mo tatanggapin. You don't just accept that what you see in social media is the reality of the totality of society. I'd like to add that the same survey says that people get, this is from SWS, Filipinos still get their news, no, from mainstream TV. TV pa rin ang pinaka source nila doon ng balita. So trivia na lang siguro yun. So yung mga nakikita niyo sa TV ngayon, anong time slot, ganyan. So may purpose yan lahat, no, why they put it that way.
Yeah, so TV is king pa rin talaga in our era. Though Zarina, to my question earlier, no, from your end, what do you think is the most significant challenge you see na hinders democratic participation?
Sige, when we talk about participation, we have to nuance both ends, no. In literature, we make the distinction between the citizen side of participation and the participatory governance side of participation, diba? In the participatory governance, this is the question of governments opening up. Okay, so ito yung action point on the side of government. So when you hear about transparency and accountability and open government, diba? These terms talk about what government should do in order to empower spaces for participation. On this regard, I would say that the challenge is that you can all it's also important to note na hindi rin homogeneous ang gobyerno, may mga mabubuting tao sa gobyerno, tandaan siguro natin yan. But with regard to the challenge, sabihin natin we can put them in a spectrum, di ba? On the government side. There are those, of course, na talagang ayaw ng democratic practices, di ba? Because may tinatago talaga sila at gusto nila to control the spaces and to control decision making for the money, the power, and everything else. So ayaw nila yon. But on the other hand, and this is something I highlight in my research, no, many government actors oftentimes don't like participatory practices because it's inconvenient. Remember that government is a machine, diba? It's a bureaucracy, it's an institution, and that it's designed to be efficient at all times. Diba? Pero when you do participation, it tends to open up Pandora's boxes, diba? Na parang pag nag-town hall ka bigla o nagbigay ka ng consultation, it's oftentimes that people don't stick with the agenda. Talagang kwento sila ng kwento ng kanilang mga gusto at lumalaki. Parang you tend to open up things that you're not ready for, diba? So this is where they resist. Because very incompatible, no, incompatible yung design of government as a machine of efficiency, diba? Versus participatory practices that really tend to open up spaces, no, for whoever agenda, etc., etc. So that one we have to look at, no, institutionally. How do we embed the oscillation, di ba? Yung galaw, yung unpredictability ng nature ng participation into our systems itself. This is why it's important to look at CSOs coming together to form their own agenda, sana independently, before they go to government, because that cuts off, no, many of the unpredictability na natatakot yung mga hindi sanay sa gobyerno na mag-participate. So on the side of government, that is what I would say the range of challenges are. Whereas the other side, sabi ko kanina ba, there's a citizen side of democratic practices, and this is where we see the continuing question of the capacity of civil society to support itself, no? Huwag nating kakalimutan na ang participation ay hindi lamang trabaho ng gobyerno na magbukas. Kailangan citizens, civil society in particular, also work its way to empower itself, to empower each other, especially. Nakikita natin that in the Philippines, no, this is just emergent, but in other countries, this is more defined, that there are civil society elites. 'Di ba? Yung sila at sila at sila at sila lang ang nakaupo, at alam din natin that civil society actors have their own politics, 'di ba? Na ang tawag dito sa literature are participatory exclusions. Yung naghaharangan din sa, they also set boundaries on each other because they compete with resources and spaces and etc. So yun yung challenge naman sa citizen civil society side, diba? That so in the government side, opening up, making sure that the oscillation and unpredictability of participation is more and more embedded into the system, diba, of government. And on the civil society end, thinking amongst ourselves, how do we prevent elitism from becoming the norm, no, in civil society practices, and then we continue to practice what we preach, diba? Inclusion, accountability amongst our ranks, and really building on each other's capacities to what Ken was saying, diba? Parang coalitions building and really bringing everyone to speed and make spaces for each other.
Thank you, Zarina. No, to our viewers, that's almost like a crash course on good governance. So thank you, Zarina, for stating all of those. Ken, you were mentioning earlier na when we're talking about democracy, it's basically people claiming space in the power structure. And we all know, well, I know na you're very busy talaga in civil society, claiming space on different priority issues. So far, in this claiming space matter, ano yung mga challenges na kinakaharap ng grupo ninyo, ng mga coalitions ninyo?
Thanks, Jules. And ang ganda ng pagkakalatag nung frameworks. Yung sa tingin kong challenge can be best exemplified, I think, by one of the coalitions that we're forming. No, second year na namin ito. It's called the People's Budget Coalition. So we're working with different CSOs, helping them articulate their budget messages, and then compiling them and forwarding them to Congress and Senate para as much as possible yung consensus positions across the different civil society groups, mas malakas yung entry dun sa congressional budget process. And if you and it's hard to pass a law. The budget is a law. It goes through many different processes within both the House and the Senate, and then it gets reconciled in the Bicameral Conference Committee, also called the Third Congress. And within each of those, may mga kailangang mahanap ka na champions to be able to sponsor your proposal. So that in itself is a very political process. So the question, and ito yung laging mahirap, no, in terms of especially engaging historically disenfranchised sectors from engaging in the budget process. Yung una, there's a gap in terms of what they think they can, what we think we can push versus what has been pushed. Kasi nga, I mean, for many CSOs who have been in the practice for decades, sometimes talagang hindi nakikinig yung agency. So there's also a sense of frustration and helplessness. That's one barrier. The second barrier is siguro there's a technical gap as well, because there's a language barrier between what policymakers think is reasonable versus what people's organizations normally push. So for example, hihingi yung isang government bureaucrat ng, sige, could you please give me a policy statement so that we can insert that in the budget? May maraming mga people's organizations na hindi pa as well-versed dun sa process na yun. And so it's very important for groups to come together help one another become more effective and push together. So I'll share in the chat what we've been able to push. So halimbawa sa COVID-19, of the 5 trillion peso budget, we think there's need to reallocate 1 trillion pesos of that to ayuda, to better healthcare services for our healthcare workers, to better transport infrastructure, to better job guarantee programs. And all of those are proposed by our for example, labor union partners sa sentro, yung mga parent leaders ng Samahan ng mga Nagkakaisang Pamilya ng Pantawid who are also members of our coalition, the members of Move as One Coalition for Transport, ang nag-push doon yung isa sa mga leaders ng National Confederation of Transport Workers Union. Among other groups, so Alliance of Healthcare Workers is also part of that. Makati Business Club is part of that. We're trying to expand and broaden our constituency so that we can push better in Congress. And thankfully, I think in the Senate, when we were briefing the senators, may mga nakapasok naman na proposals. No, we knew that 1 trillion is a big amount, but it also shows you how important it is for us to engage that process, to make sure that we get the resources that we deserve from a government that we fund through our taxpayer money, and the government we elect. So in that, you'll see us also trying to work with the media, to work with journalists, to also frame the budget message as well. So ito po yung lahat ng sa tingin ko mga barriers to participation that we're trying in practice to help bridge. And it really is with listening that we can do it. Dapat hindi ka gahaman sa mikropono, hindi ka dapat gahaman sa credit. No, it should be something that's shared with the community. And as much as possible, the leaders of the sectors that are in most need or are most affected get a chance to actually forward the agenda.
Thank you, Ken. Yeah, that's very important, no, na mas maging relatable yung budget process sa mga kababayan natin. Hindi lang yung from the news lang nila makukuha na the numbers, pero how each number siguro is relatable to the basic issues. Basically, paano siya magiging gut issue itong budget natin. Yun yung pinakamahalaga when we're talking about the budget process. We are accepting, no, we are accepting several questions right now. And may interesting question ako nakita. I guess we could ask this again, sorry, to Zarina again. What's your take on this from Kenneth from MSU Gensan? What are the demerits of democracy?
Wala. We have to make a stand, no?
Yes, yes.
Democracy is the only kind of governance that can correct itself. So whatever it is that we're experiencing as problems of democracy, you cannot solve it by non-democratic means. And that is where what Gudyon was mentioning earlier, people have been frustrated because forms of representative institutions and ideologies behind policies, no, have insufficiently delivered, no, on the expectations of its people. And what we saw all over the world, no, in the 2010s onwards is really people giving up on the nitty-gritty and the difficulties of doing democracy. Pero we highlight na hindi mo maitatama ang democracy kung magpaparaya ka. You surrender, no, your right to speak, your civic freedoms and everything else dahil pagod ka na, diba? Participatory frustration is real. Dissatisfaction with government is real with regard to expectations, diba? But you don't solve that by giving up your democratic rights and the space that is accorded to you as citizens of democratic societies. Any other problem would be problems of form. Diba? Yung magulo, maingay, etc. Yan yung mga usually na naririnig natin. But the normative side of democracy should not be limited, no, by the problems of its form. The form practices, no, is really a problem of the lack of imagination. Diba? Kung napapagod tayo at nahihirapan tayo sa mga paraan that we're practicing democracy today, kanino problema yon, diba? I mean, that's not, again, problema din natin yon. That's why we keep on saying that the forms of democracy, and the problems it causes, these are things that only also just a democracy will fix. So we'll stand by that. No, there's no demerit in democracy. The moment you give up on democracy is the moment that you fail the people. So you just have to keep on going on that.
Thanks, Zarina, for that very sharp answer. How about for you, Gudyon and Ken? Some of the notions na lumalabas when we're talking about democracy, especially in our time right now, they say na wala namang problema sa democracy kasi people can still speak kahit na merong nasarang network, kahit merong isang kumpanya na sobrang daming mga kaso, isang media company na maraming mga kaso. So how do we deal with this kinds of notion na people just remain, just choose to be neutral just because they feel democracy isn't attacked? Kasi people are still speaking up, media networks are still able to publish their stories, etc. So how do we make them realize the bigger picture, Gudyon?
Well, we really have to recognize that in terms of democracy, I fully agree that there are so many political arrangements that have been proposed, but I believe that liberal democracy is the least objectionable system in which we can freely fight power, inequalities, and exclusion. So that's something that is a principle that I would like to state. And at the same time, however, we see that dictators have been democratically elected. Authoritarianism has been insinuated in many societies through the electoral process. And many of these tyrants have escaped accountability by claiming the very rights that democracy has afforded people. The right to due process, diba? The right for the elderly to be protected from prosecution. All of these things have been twisted and mobilized by people who wish our country harm or wish to exploit our country. So there has to be an independent, that's the very point of media in democracy, is to fiscalize, is to look at what's going on. And this media has to be defended as though it's a core of democracy. And it should be very clear to any observer of our politics that there are assaults to press freedom. It's very important for us to rally behind those people who are at the forefront of truth telling, while also acknowledging the plurality that Zarina mentioned in terms of what we might look at. We have to also broaden our imagination. So inclusivity has to be there as well in terms of media. I think that one of the objections to media is that it's also central, it's also concentrated, and local media face even greater threats than national media in terms of this radio. They don't get so much attention, but we've seen so many local journalists being intimidated. So we need to recognize this as a core issue. We need to also mobilize social media as part of this function of traditional media, which is to fiscalize government. And that's where young people come in. That's we need young people to really write, like I told you earlier, isulat nyo yung mga nararanasan nyo. Write about your engage. Act as though your opinions matter because they do. So never assume any kind of insignificance, because the moment we resign ourselves to the ako, realistically, in my column in Inquirer, I don't think people, sometimes I think wala naman nagbabasa nito eh. But I have to act as though people do, because we have to assume that we matter in the same way that we cannot look at our country as something that's insignificant as well. That's why the title of my book is The Philippines is Not a Small Country. We are a diverse nation composed of different cultures within our country. We're composed of so many people, and that's our strength. We have to act as though we are valuable both as individuals and as a country.
Thanks, Gudyon. For Ken, if you want to answer that the same question, you can. But I'd like to add another question for you, Ken. Gudyon mentioned na we have to assume that people matter, and that should be the idealistic case, diba? But when you're engaging with coalitions, with people, especially those people who are untapped yet, diba, yung mga hindi pa organized, ano yung usual na situation on the ground? Do they feel na their inputs really matter? And if not, how do you make them realize na yes, it does?
Thanks, Jules. Gudyon, I read your columns. And I think they matter a lot, especially your column on the rivers having life. I think that's a beautiful way to put it. It energized us in the Ilog Pasiglahin movement, which Move as One is also a part. But here, Jules, especially the unorganized ones, share ko siguro that we're now working with some organizations or some scientists and researchers who want a better research environment in the Philippines. So it's a wonderful group, pero hindi pa organized. And one of the things that I found, as I was listening to this friend who wants to organize researchers and scientists to improve, pay in among research assistants, to improve the timely release of scholarship grants in the OST and SHED, for example. Na-realize ko na kailangan magkasama talaga. Hindi yung tipong hindi pwedeng mag-organize ka tapos feeling mo mas magaling ka sa iba. Diba, kailangan magkasama. It needs to be beside another person, and helping journey and walk with that person through moments of, ang sinasabi niya nga, throughout the process, parang may political awakening daw. And the awakening is, that we can actually organize. We can come together and we can actually push for something that our sectors deserve, that we deserve, because we deserve better. And it's such an empowering insight. And the key, I think, in many of these coalition engagements is to show the entire breadth of tools. No, kasi, di ba, posting on social media is one tool. Di ba? It's one tool to share there's definitely space for that. Media and press releases and press conferences are another tool. But there's also so many other tools, like negotiating, not just writing letters, meeting with decision makers. Ang tawag sa negotiation literature dito, parang the escalation strategy. Diba? There shouldn't be unnecessary escalation during a negotiation. You need to exhaust all of your diplomatic means, peaceful diplomatic means, before siguro escalating the tone na hindi siya, incompetent siya, ganyan. Parang hindi naman ganun kaagad. Diba? May history of engagement na kailangan. And that's, I think, where negotiation and conflict resolution and mediation is one of those subjects and theories that I think we should teach more or practice more as a people, and especially honing and building those coalitions. So yun yung isa sa mga emerging coalitions na fino-form namin. There was another coalition na feeling ko maganda lang ding i-share kasi it's so relevant to COVID-19 dito sa Tarabangan kontra COVID. It really started with what we called community listening exercises. There was a point in June, when Naga cases were so high. People in Naga were so frustrated by both the national government response and the local government response. And there was a sense in which parang hindi nagta-translate yung recommendations from the community to our health emergency response task force. So what we did was we had 4 FGDs. Super simple lang siya. We call them community listening exercises where we just ask of all these pillars in COVID response. So prevent, detect, isolate, treat, reintegrate, vaccinate. What was your experience? And how can it be better? What do you suggest to the city government? Of course, during that session, walang government employee. So people were free to really just air their concerns and their frustrations about government. But we, as researchers or as people who were trying to convene the body, we also integrated some of those responses. Parang, what do you call that? Synthesize namin yung responses into, feedback that our mayor would understand better. So we gave our mayor that presentation, and then he asked us to sit on our health emergency response task force, and we still sit in our health emergency response task force, and that's how we came to be engaged across the different sectors. By the way, some of our volunteers in Tarabangan Contra COVID are here. Hello. And thank you for being such active citizens. We've been able to manage 2 surges because of participation in COVID response, and we're very, very proud of our citizens for engaging that process.
Okay, thanks Ken for sharing that. I think that's one of the best practices that we should amplify kasi nakapag-claim kayo basically ng space in the power structure. So congratulations on that. So to our panelists, we have a question from Owen Lava, and this is a very interesting one. In terms of democracy, ano ang parameters ng democratic process? Tapos pwede natin idikit dito, paano nila ma-distinguish kung sino ang youth activist and youth volunteer, sapagkat nabasagan ng red tagging ang isa sa mga nag-lead ng community pantry sa Maginhawa. So thank you and God bless you. Okay, so ito Zarina, Gudyon, and Ken, no? How do we distinguish, or meron ba talagang pagkakaiba in the first place itong pagiging youth activist at pagiging isang youth volunteer in the realm of civil society? Zarina, go ahead.
Ako ulit. Paano ba to? Dito sa Pilipinas, some words are loaded, politically loaded. If you return to roots, there's really there's no substantive distinction. If you're volunteering on political participation, civic engagement, and if you're being an activist, diba? Parang, in essence, essentially, wala naman difference on. But the language, as you said, has been loaded here in the Philippines for many reasons that will constitute a 3-hour lecture. No? So siguro mas na-curious ako dun sa tanong na ano yung parameters na hinahanap natin. Parang I would be careful, no, to put in terms like may parameters ba, because it assumes that there are acceptable and non-acceptable ways of being engaged. Whereas in fact, it's a matter of matching what strategies can be effective given the terrain of influencing governance. Siguro atras ako ng konti, no. May mga narinig niyo na to, medyo nabanggit na din siya kanina. There are closed spaces, there are invited spaces, there are open spaces, di ba? Kapag open yung space mo, ibig sabihin, sige, pasok ka lang, di ba? And it's very easy, it's very pleasant to participate in government, and there's a lot of flexibility of what you can do. Invited spaces have political interference, no? Diyan na pumapasok yung napopolitika, yung inclusion and exclusion criteria, kung sino yung nakakapasok or hindi. So, ibig sabihin, what if you're part of the excluded groups, di ba? Now, it's a challenge of imagination and really looking at the political opportunity structures, 'di ba? Ano yung opportunities na gamay mo, ng gamay ng grupo niyo para makapasok kayo at makagawa kayo ng claimed spaces, 'di ba? Spaces that you create and put forward in the realm of the public agenda, 'di ba? Kaya historically, that's where the arts have been, 'di ba? Like public performances, books, etc. That's where yan, I mean, again, 3-hour lecture, diba? Pero yon, invited spaces, there's that. And then closed spaces, no? Especially when civic spaces are in real threat, no? Just to level off, there are worse countries in the world, okay? Na talagang hindi ka man lang makakapag-post ng something, no? Without expecting real repercussions, no, on your person. There are worse countries to be in. But nonetheless, no, closed spaces, kapag hindi ka pag talagang walang initiative, no, at hinaharangan talaga ng government actors yung spaces to participate, ganun din siya, diba? Then you think of how then, what then are appropriate, effective actions, no, to do, to engage and still try to influence governance because it's important to you. Siguro ganun, siguro doon ako lalagay dun sa tanong na yun. No? Parang let's not say that there is a proper and improper parameter, that there's a correct one and incorrect one. At the end of the day, it is our duty to keep on innovating and imagining possibilities to exert influence, no? to really make governance responsive to what is important to us.
Thanks, Zarina. How about you, Gudyon? Where do we draw the line, or should there be a line in the first place to draw? Activist ba agad kapag volunteer, or is there even something wrong with being an activist?
So I think that labels don't matter, and we should reject labels. We have been, in our country, there's a tyranny of labeling in our country. And this is something that we should all rally behind in rejecting, because labels can limit us. Labels can create boundaries when there are none. That's why I think as a starting point, we should feel that we should reject labels. But at the same time, how can you just say I reject labels when labels are being forced upon you, when you are being tagged as something? So part of this move of rejecting labels is to use it as a guide of sino ba yung mga tao na who thrive, who are the people whose politics thrive on labeling others. Diba? This is a populist trope. We're entering the territory of populism here, in which people want to divide us. Politicians want to divide people and deceive them into thinking that they actually have their enemies, when in fact there's so many things that we can work together in. So volunteer, advocate, activist, even influencer is something that has taken on a negative connotation. But why not? Why should we shirk from the influence of social media for good? All of these labels should not limit us. And to all our young people here, don't be discouraged by all of these labels, because in the end, it is not what people are labeled as, but it's what people do and how we try to help our communities that matter, prioritizing issues that are marginalized, prioritizing issues of social justice, my work has taken me to engage with young people who use drugs, young people who have been accused of who have been victimized by the so-called drug war. And again, if you start labeling people as addict, that's the same thing going on. They're already cast into a certain lens and stigmatized accordingly. So that's a starting point, I think, is for us to recognize that labels can hurt people. And if we are to be a democracy that is dynamic, if we are to be a democracy that is pluralistic in the way we think, then we should do away with them and choose leaders who recognize that we have to be open with what young people can bring to the table instead of dismissing certain groups as a certain subversiveness, di ba? Parang recently they even banned books, I think, that they were trying to define certain books as subversive. I think we should reject these things because that's also a form of labeling the books as subversive. So yun lang for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Gudyon. Ayan important reminder yan sa ating lahat na huwag tayo ma-discourage just because some groups or individuals are being labeled. Speaking of labels, no, Ken, you're very much active engaging with different people on the ground and communities. What's your take on this, and have you experienced yung groups nyo na malabel din for some of the things that you're doing on the ground?
We get stray comments sometimes in Facebook or messages sometimes. Pero naisip naisip kasi namin halimbawa nung nirelease namin yung findings ng Citizens Budget Tracker on Formally. Nung nirelease namin yon, may mga ibang parang nagtataas ng kilay nila. And I think some of our members were even being cast to say parang they're just promoting their accounting services when we released our Formally report. Tapos kami parang hindi naman yun yung gusto namin gawin. We just really want to know where our taxpayer money went. Pero that said, I also agree we should be rejecting some of these very harmful and dangerous labels, especially if there's normally people are harmed, like physically harmed when those labels are given to any person. So we're very I think we try as much as possible in our coalitions to really protect one another, or help and have a support group for people just in case meron silang ganun na experience. And thankfully we are, because we organize in a community and we can't do it ourselves. Because we organize in a community, we have a support system whenever we receive some of those negative comments from people who are commenting on our work. But that said, another thing in the public sphere is, diba, we also have a responsibility to be careful about what we say in public. And what I mean by that is, before we released our research on 20 billion pesos worth of COVID-19 contracts, of which around 500 million pesos yung posibleng ma-save ng pamahalaan if goods had been bought at typical prices. We went through a really rigorous process of asking the experts, of people poking holes at our report, even showing the report first to some government agencies who baka na out of context lang namin yung data or something before we published the report. And it was important for us to go through that rigorous process, also to protect our researchers who are part of our group. So as part din siya ng research ethics, di ba, yung how do you minimize the risk? How do you maximize the benefit to society with the research that you put out? And so when we released that report recently, we were there were still some risks, especially kami na who speak out publicly on these issues. But those risks are managed to an acceptable level, we think, that people consent to, who are part of our research team. And I think that's part of, how important truth is. And, that data point itself, yung 500 million pesos that could have been saved from 5 billion pesos worth of contracts. It took us 6 months to be able to develop that statement. And that is a statement that's based on, empirical evidence. And that's very hard to refute because we can give you the entire technical data set. Like, let's argue based on that. And it's important for us to guard those statements of fact. And that's something that we can do to protect one another as well.
Okay, thank you, Ken. All right, so we are at the last part of this segment, and we only have, I think, less than 5 minutes to wrap this up. So for a closing message to all our panelists, the youth, of course, time and again is believed to be the drivers of change. And in fact, COMELEC released the number of voters for the 2022 elections. That's around, I think, 66.9 million registered voters, and 30% of this number is coming from the youth sector, 18 to 30 years old. So given this context, how important is youth participation in democratic governance, and particularly what is their main specific role? Very quickly lang, pasadahan na lang natin as your closing message. Let's begin with you, Gudyon, for this time.
Well, young people, this is a time when there's still a pandemic, and I know that many of you are not really that excited about the future because of so many crisis upon crisis, diba? Climate crisis, and then pandemic, and then our political crisis. But I would like to encourage you to tell you that no, exactly because we have all of these crises, exactly why we must not give up. This is a time when it's a make or break for the country and the planet, and for the people we love, for the communities that we hold dear. So it's precisely because of all of these issues, and I understand how they can be heavy and can weigh us down. But now is not the time to give up. Now is the time I encourage you to really write and articulate the many thoughts that you have, the many ideas that you have, the many experiences that you have, whether in activism, volunteerism, even in your everyday experiences. Don't limit yourself, because there are many ways to be engaged. It can be through writing poetry. It can be through art. It can be through the humanities. It can be through music. So many people, I'm sure you've seen all of these cartoonists on Twitter, and they're very influential because art matters. The humanities matter, the social sciences, and of course, whatever course you take, even outside school, through community building, through organizing, all of these matter, and don't be discouraged. I think that it's a time for us to really recognize that there's hope for our country, especially if we all recognize the significance that we all hold, regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of where you are in the Philippines right now, or even elsewhere. So, yun lang, more power to everyone, your organizations, your communities. And please feel free to reach out. I'm sure I speak for both Ken, Zar, and even Jules, that feel free to reach out to us if there's something that you think that we can help you with.
Salamat, Gudyon. Ken, how about you? Your closing message.
Yeah, I think 2022 is the fight of our lives. And it's so important for us to vote and be active in the campaign process, and push our candidates to take up the agenda that we think we deserve as a people. It's so important. Again, it's the fight of our lives, and we're happy to also engage more folks in some of the coalitions that we're building. If you're interested some of the Facebook. I'll post some of the Facebook pages that we have in case you're interested in volunteering through in budget advocacy, transport, among other groups that we're pushing. Even COVID response, if you're in Camarines Sur or in Naga, we'd be glad to work with you, and let's continue to claim our space and claim our rightful place in government and governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken Abante, sharing with us to claim our space in the power structure. Thank you so much, Ken, and congratulations sa lahat ng ginagawa mo. And of course, Zarina, go ahead to end this panel.
Siguro what I'll remind all our participants is that being youth is temporal, no? Youth is temporary. Kami, youth din kami dati. Hindi kayo youth always, no? Pero ano yung implication nun, ano? Remember that every generation faces its challenge, no, for the nation. Our lolas may have been there during the Second World War. Our parents could have been active during martial law, diba? At nandito tayo ngayon, no? Nakikitayo ako kahit lampas na ako dun sa parameters, no? But this is ours. Now I understand that I hear the youth from with what they say na lagi kasi kaming sinasabihan na wala naman daw kami nung panahon na yon, or hindi naman daw namin alam, or we know so little of what has been done. Yeah, of course there's value to history, no, but maybe there's a point of you not knowing everything that has been done before, because we cannot solve the problems of now with the same strategies that have been done with the problems of the past. You have to find your own way into this, diba? Matuto sa sinasabi ng mga nagdaan na, pero hindi ibig sabihin ay yun na yun, diba? This is our story, diba? And this is our moment in Philippine history. So kung ano yung gagawin natin from here on sa elections and all the next 6 years, the next decade to come, no? SDG deadline 2030, ambition 2040, diba? This is your time. So let's be cognizant of that. Let's remind ourselves that the youth is always that cohort of hope, because there are things that we know only you can imagine. We will be here, we will support you. We're slowly transitioning to the old, diba? But feel free to write your history, to write our history, and make your transitional youthness count. Ayun lang.
Thank you, Zarina. That's very empowering to our youth leaders here. Palakpakan natin ating mga speakers. Okay, so sabi ni Miss Zarina sa atin, write your and our history. Okay, panahon nyo to ngayon, kaya rin tayo may mga programa na pinangunahan ng youth-led para mabigyan kayo ng space and opportunities to hone your skills so we could write together our history collectively. All right, so once again, palakpakan natin ang ating speakers, Dr. Gudyon LASCO, Ms. Zarina MEDINA-GUCE, and Ken Abante. Thank you so much for imparting your insights sa ating mga youth leaders this afternoon.